They laughed at her like she was nothing, but none of them knew they were being watched by the one man who never forgets a debt. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe dignity matters, stay with this story. Now back to Naomi Brooks. Standing under the golden glow of a $50,000 chandelier in a Manhattan ballroom where every glass sparkled and every smile hid judgment. Her black uniform pressed perfectly, her movements quiet, precise, invisible, just the way they liked her, just the way survival had taught her to be, until the moment everything slipped, the crystal glass tilting from her tray, red wine spilling across ivory silk heels that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and the room shifted, laughter sharp as broken glass cutting through the music. Are you serious right now? The woman snapped, pulling her foot back as if Naomi had contaminated the air itself, whispers spreading, eyes turning, measuring, judging, reducing her to a mistake. Naomi's hands trembling for just a second before she steadied them, her voice soft, controlled. I'm so sorry, ma'am. But the apology only fed the cruelty. Sorry doesn't fix this. Another guest added, his tone dripping with mockery. People like you should stay in the back where you belong. And there it was, not just the insult, but the reminder of where they believed she stood, beneath them, beneath notice, beneath dignity, and across the room, seated in the shadowed corner where the light barely reached, a man watched without moving, his suit dark, his presence quiet, but heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Naomi didn't see him. She only saw the polished marble floor reflecting her own stillness as the CEO himself, Daniel Reeves, approached with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Clean it up, he said lightly, as if this were entertainment. As if her humiliation were part of the evening's program, a few guests chuckled, one even, stepping forward, extending his shoe slightly. Might as well get both while you're down there. And the room leaned in, waiting, watching, expecting her to fold, to shrink, to disappear, but Naomi didn't move. Not yet. Her fingers tightening around the edge of the tray, her breathing steady, her eyes lifting just enough to meet the moment without surrendering to it, and somewhere, behind the laughter, behind the clinking glasses and whispered judgments, a voice had not yet spoken, a decision had not yet been made, and the man in the shadows, the one no one had noticed, leaned forward just slightly, his gaze fixed not on the spill, not on the guests, but on Naomi herself, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment all along, and the room, still loud with cruelty, had no idea it was seconds away from falling completely silent. Naomi could feel every eye pressing against her like heat from a spotlight, the laughter lingering just long enough to make silence feel heavier when it finally came, her fingers slowly lowering the tray to the table beside her as the faint hum of conversation twisted into something sharper, more expectant. Daniel Reeves watching her with that same polished indifference, the kind that had been practiced in boardrooms and charity galas, the kind that said people like her were replaceable, temporary, forgettable. Well, he prompted, tilting his head slightly as if this were a simple test she was failing in real time. And Naomi swallowed the tightness in her throat, her heart beating steady despite the tremor still hiding in her hands, because this was not the first time the world had tried to shrink her, not the first time she had been asked to choose between survival and self-respect, and somewhere deep inside, something refused to bend. I will clean it, sir, she said quietly, her voice even, controlled, but I will not kneel. And the words landed like a disruption no one had ordered, a ripple through the room that replaced amusement with discomfort. A guest scoffed, another muttered something under his breath, but the energy had shifted, no longer playful, no longer easy, and Daniel's smile thinned just enough to reveal the irritation beneath it. You are not in a position to negotiate, he replied, his tone still calm, but edged now, sharper. You work here, which means you follow instructions. And Naomi held his gaze for a fraction longer than she should have, not challenging, not defiant, just present, just refusing to disappear, and that alone unsettled him more than any raised voice could have, because invisibility was the rule, and she had just broken it without making a sound. Across the room, the man in the shadows shifted again, his fingers resting lightly against the glass in his hand, untouched, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if studying not the conflict itself, but the choices unfolding within it. The details most people missed. The way Naomi stood without trembling now. The way she did not argue, did not plead, but also did not surrender. And there, just beneath the cuff of her sleeve, something caught the light. A thin, worn bracelet, simple, almost invisible, yet distinct in a way that made his attention sharpen. A memory brushing the edges of his mind, faint but persistent, like a name you almost remember. And back in the center of the room, the tension tightened further, one of the guests stepping closer again, lowering his voice just enough to sound personal. "You think you are too good for this?" he asked, a smirk curling at the corner of his mouth, and Naomi shook her head slightly. "No, sir," she answered, her tone steady. "I just know who I am." And that was the moment something in the room shifted. Completely. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. The kind of shift that happens when a line is drawn without being announced. Daniel exhaled slowly, clearly done with the disruption, already preparing to end it the way men like him always did, with dismissal, with control, with consequences. "Then perhaps you should find somewhere else to be," he said, gesturing lightly toward the exit, as if erasing her required nothing more than a wave of his hand. And just as Naomi inhaled to respond, just as the weight of that decision settled over her shoulders, a chair moved, quiet but unmistakable, the sound cutting through everything. And for the first time that evening, the room turned toward the corner it had ignored all night, because the man who had been sitting there, silent, unseen, was finally standing up. The sound of the chair moving did not need to be loud to command attention. It carried something else, something heavier, the kind of quiet authority that made conversations die mid-sentence and laughter fade into uncertainty. And as the man stepped forward from the shadows, the light finally caught him, revealing a presence that did not ask for recognition yet demanded it instantly. His suit tailored but unremarkable to the untrained eye, his expression calm but unreadable, and still, something about him shifted the air in the room, because power, real power, rarely needed to introduce itself. Naomi felt it before she fully saw him. The subtle change in the room's rhythm. The way even Daniel Reeves straightened slightly without realizing it. The way the guests who had been so confident moments ago suddenly became aware of themselves, adjusting posture, lowering voices, as if instinctively recognizing a hierarchy they could not explain. The man walked slowly, deliberately, his gaze never leaving Naomi, not the spill, not the guests, not the CEO, just her. And when he stopped, it was not in front of Daniel, not beside the offended guest, but directly in front of Naomi, close enough to notice the small details others had ignored, the steadiness in her breathing, the quiet strength in her posture. And then his eyes dropped, just briefly, to her wrist, to the bracelet, worn, simple, out of place in a room filled with diamonds and gold. And something in his expression shifted, subtle, but unmistakable, like a memory locking into place. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, yet carrying across the room with effortless clarity. The question unexpected, almost disarming in its simplicity. Naomi hesitated for just a second, not out of fear, but because no one had ever asked about it before. "It was a gift," she said softly, her fingers instinctively brushing against it. "From someone I helped a long time ago." The room remained still, waiting, confused, because this was not the direction anyone had anticipated. Daniel stepped forward, attempting to regain control, his tone polite but strained. "I am sorry, sir, but this situation is being handled." And for the first time, the man turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him, a glance that was not dismissive, not aggressive, just final. "Is it?" he replied, and those two words carried more weight than any raised voice could have, because they were not a challenge, they were a judgment. Daniel's confidence faltered, just slightly, enough for others to notice, enough for the room to feel it, and the man's attention returned to Naomi, studying her more closely now, as if confirming something only he could see. "You helped someone," he repeated, slower this time, and Naomi nodded, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "Yes, sir." And there it was again, that shift, deeper now, undeniable, the kind that moves beneath the surface before breaking through. The guests exchanged glances, whispers forming again but quieter, uncertain, because whatever this was, it no longer felt like entertainment. It felt like something else entirely, something unfolding that none of them controlled. And then the man straightened slightly, his presence filling the space without effort, his gaze lifting from Naomi to the rest of the room. And when he spoke again, it was no longer a question, it was a statement, one that landed with quiet precision. "Then I suggest," he said, his voice calm, almost measured, "you all take a moment to reconsider how you treat people whose stories you do not know." And just like that, the room did not just fall silent, it held its breath, because something had changed, something irreversible, and Naomi, standing in the center of it all, realized that for the first time that night, she was no longer the smallest person in the room. No one moved, not because they were told to, but because something in the man's presence made movement feel like a mistake, like stepping out of line in a way no one could quite define. Daniel Reeves forced a small laugh, the kind used to recover control in rooms he was used to owning. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," he said, smoothing his jacket as if resetting the moment. "We are simply maintaining standards here." But the words sounded thinner now, stripped of the confidence they carried just minutes ago, because the man did not react, did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply looked at him. And in that look was something far more unsettling than anger. It was recognition, the kind that measures a person completely in silence, and then sets them aside. "Standards," the man repeated quietly, almost as if testing the word itself, his gaze drifting briefly across the room, taking in the polished marble floors, the expensive gowns, the carefully curated image of success, before returning to Naomi. "Interesting choice," he added, and the faintest shift in tone made it clear he was not agreeing. Naomi stood still, her heart steady now in a way she could not fully explain, as if the weight pressing down on her earlier had been lifted just enough to let her breathe again. But she did not speak, did not step forward, because something told her this moment was no longer hers to carry. One of the guests attempted to recover the earlier energy, forcing a smile. "Look, it was just a small incident. No need to make it into something dramatic," he said, glancing around for agreement. But the room did not respond the way it had before. The laughter did not return, the ease was gone, replaced by a quiet awareness that something more important was unfolding. Something none of them fully understood. The man's attention shifted again, back to Naomi's wrist, to the bracelet that seemed almost insignificant to everyone else, but not to him, never to him. "You said it was a gift," he said, his voice softer now, but no less controlled. "From someone you helped." Naomi nodded, her fingers brushing it again, this time with a trace of something deeper, memory. "Yes, sir," she replied. "It was a long time ago, just something small." And the man's expression changed again, not visibly enough for most to notice, but enough to alter the space around him, because to him, it had not been small, not even close. Daniel stepped in again, more urgently this time, sensing the shift slipping further out of his control. "Sir, with all due respect, this is a private event," he said, his tone tightening, "and I cannot allow disruptions." And that was when the man finally turned fully toward him, not abruptly, not aggressively, just completely, as if acknowledging him properly for the first time. "You cannot allow disruptions," he repeated, and there was something almost reflective in the way he said it, as if considering the statement rather than challenging it. And then, without raising his voice, without changing his posture, he asked a single question. "Do you know who I am?" And the room shifted again, deeper this time, because it was not the question itself, it was the certainty behind it, the quiet assurance that the answer mattered more than anything that had been said so far. Daniel hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough for the closest guests to notice, enough for uncertainty to ripple outward, and the man did not wait for an answer. He simply let the silence sit, heavy, deliberate, until it became its own kind of answer, and then his gaze moved back to Naomi one more time, steady, certain, as if confirming something only he understood. And in that moment, the balance of the room was no longer unclear, it had shifted completely. Even if no one had yet spoken the truth out loud, Daniel Reeves did not answer immediately. And that silence spoke louder than anything he could have said, because in rooms like this, Hesitation was a currency no one could afford, yet it had already been spent. The guests exchanged glances, subtle but sharp, the kind that asked questions without words. Who is he? Why does this feel different? Why does this moment suddenly matter? And the man did not rush it. He did not repeat himself. He simply waited, allowing the weight of the question to settle, to grow, to become unavoidable, until Daniel finally forced a breath. I believe I do, he said carefully, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him, and that was enough. Enough for the man to tilt his head slightly, not in approval, not in rejection, just acknowledgement. Then you understand, he replied, his tone even, controlled, that what happens next is not about your event, or your guests, or your standards. And the words did not need emphasis. They carried their own authority. It is about respect. And the room felt it. The shift from spectacle to something far more serious, something that could not be laughed away or dismissed with a gesture. Naomi stood still, her breathing calm now, her earlier tension replaced by something quieter, something steadier, because for the first time since the glass had fallen, she was no longer alone in the moment. The man's gaze returned to her once more, and this time, there was no distance in it, no observation, only certainty. You said you helped someone, he continued, his voice softer, but somehow even more present. Do you remember where? Naomi hesitated, not out of fear, but because the memory itself came slowly, like something she had never expected to matter again. It was near the river, she said, her voice thoughtful now. About 2 years ago, there was a child. He had fallen. People were shouting, but no one moved, so I did. The room leaned in without realizing it, drawn not by command, but by something deeper, the pull of a story they had not expected to hear. I stayed with him until help came, she added, almost as if explaining something ordinary, something anyone would have done. But the man's expression shifted again, unmistakably this time, because he knew that was not true. Not everyone would have stepped forward. Not everyone would have stayed. Daniel frowned slightly, trying to follow, trying to regain control of a narrative that was no longer his. I do not see how that is relevant, he said, his voice tighter now, and the man turned to him once more, fully this time. Of course you do not, he replied calmly, not dismissive, not cruel, just certain. And then he took a step closer, not toward Daniel, but toward the center of the room, placing himself where everyone could see him clearly, no longer in shadow, no longer unnoticed. And when he spoke again, his voice did not rise, but it carried through every corner of the ballroom with absolute clarity. That child, he said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle, was my son. And the silence that followed was not just quiet, it was complete. The kind that erased everything that came before it, every laugh, every whisper, every careless word. Naomi's eyes widened slightly, not in fear, but in recognition, the memory aligning in a way she had never expected, while Daniel stood frozen, the meaning of the moment finally catching up to him. And the guests who had once laughed now found themselves standing in a room that no longer belonged to them, because everything had changed, and none of them had seen it coming. The words did not echo. They settled, heavy and undeniable, as if the air itself refused to move past them. And for a moment no one breathed, no one shifted, because the meaning was too large to process all at once. Naomi's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her apron as the memory came back with sudden clarity. The cold edge of the river, the sound of panicked voices, the small hand gripping hers. She had never known who he was, only that he needed help, and she had given it without question, without expectation. And now that quiet moment had followed her into a room filled with power she had never sought. Daniel Reeves blinked once, then again, as if trying to reset the reality in front of him. But there was no reset, no correction, only consequence. Your son, he repeated slowly, the words feeling unfamiliar in his mouth, and the man nodded once, not dramatically, not for effect, just confirming what had already changed everything. Yes, he said, his voice calm. But there was something beneath it now, something deeper than authority, something personal. The child you dismissed as irrelevant tonight is the reason I am standing here. And that landed differently, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as truth, simple and unavoidable. The guests who had once leaned in for Entertainment now stood completely still, their earlier confidence gone, replaced by a quiet awareness of how quickly perception could betray them. Naomi looked at him, really looked this time, and saw not just the composed man in front of her, but the weight behind his words, the memory he carried, the recognition that had not been immediate but had been certain once it arrived. "I did not know," she said softly, not as an apology, but as acknowledgement, and he inclined his head slightly. "You were not supposed to," he replied, his tone steady. "That is what makes it matter." And the room felt it again, that shift, deeper now, because this was no longer about status or control. It was about something far more rare, something none of them could manufacture or buy. Daniel took a step back without realizing it, the space between him and the center of the room widening, as if he no longer belonged where he had been standing. "If there has been a misunderstanding," he began, but the words faltered before they could form anything solid, because there was no misunderstanding left to correct, only actions that could not be undone. The man's gaze moved across the room once more, not searching, not judging, simply observing, and every person felt it in their own way, the quiet evaluation of choices made when no one thought they mattered. "Respect is not something you turn on when it is convenient," he said, his voice even, but carrying through every corner of the ballroom. "It is what you show when you believe no one important is watching." And no one responded, because there was nothing to say, nothing that could balance what had already been revealed. Naomi stood at the center of it all, no longer shrinking, no longer invisible, her posture steady, her presence undeniable in a way that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with something far more enduring. And the man turned back to her one last time, his expression no longer unreadable, but clear in a way that needed no explanation. "You gave my son something I could not buy," he said quietly. "You gave him time, and you gave him care." And the room felt that too, the weight of something priceless placed beside something they had treated as disposable. And in that moment, without anyone raising their voice, without any dramatic gesture, the entire balance of the night shifted completely, leaving behind only one truth that no one in that room could ignore anymore. No one dared to speak after that, not because they were told to remain silent, but because something inside each of them had already shifted beyond words, the kind of silence that follows truth when it finally arrives uninvited. Daniel Reeves adjusted his cuff again, but this time the movement was slower, uncertain, as if even small gestures required permission he no longer had. "I was not aware," he said finally, his voice controlled but stripped of its earlier confidence. And the man looked at him, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with something far more final, understanding, the kind that closes a door rather than opens one. "That is exactly the problem," he replied quietly, and the weight of that sentence settled deeper than anything else that had been said, because it was not about this moment alone, it was about every moment before it. Every assumption, every dismissal, every quiet act of disrespect that had gone unnoticed until now. The guests shifted slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to reveal discomfort, their earlier amusement now replaced with the uneasy awareness that they had participated in something they no longer understood. Naomi remained where she was, but her posture had changed completely, not taller, not louder, just grounded, as if she had finally been seen in a way that required no defense. The man turned to her again, and this time there was no distance left between who he was and what he felt. "You stood your ground," he said, his voice steady, even when it would have been easier not to. Naomi held his gaze, her expression calm, her voice soft but certain. "I just did what felt right," she answered, and he nodded once, as if confirming something he had already known. "That is what makes it rare," he said, and then he did something no one in that room expected, something that shifted the entire weight of the moment once more. He stepped slightly closer and lowered his head, not dramatically, not for attention, but in a gesture so simple and so deliberate that it carried more meaning than any grand display of power, and the room felt it instantly, the inversion of everything they believed they understood. Daniel's breath caught almost imperceptibly. The guests froze again, because respect, real respect, had just been placed where they had denied it minutes before, and there was no way to ignore it now. The man straightened again, his presence unchanged but the meaning of it completely transformed. From this moment forward, he said, turning his gaze briefly across the room, she is not to be treated as invisible. And no one questioned it. No one laughed. No one challenged it, because the authority behind those words was no longer abstract. It was absolute. Naomi did not smile, did not react outwardly, but something in her eyes softened, not from relief, not from validation, but from recognition, the kind that comes when dignity is no longer something you have to protect alone. And as the room remained still, held in that quiet shift, it became clear to everyone present that what had just happened would not be forgotten, not because of who he was, but because of what he had chosen to see. And in that moment, without a single raised voice, the definition of power in that room had been rewritten completely. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted slowly, like a room learning how to breathe again after holding too much for too long. But nothing returned to what it had been. The laughter did not come back. The ease did not return, because something fundamental had been exposed, something no one could unsee. Daniel Reeves cleared his throat, but the sound felt small now, almost misplaced in a space that no longer responded to him the same way. Of course, he said, forcing composure back into his tone. There has clearly been a misjudgment, and even he seemed to hear how hollow it sounded, how late it arrived, because respect offered after revelation is never the same as respect given freely. The guests began to shift, some stepping back slightly, others lowering their eyes, not out of shame alone, but out of the quiet realization that they had followed a tone that was never theirs to set. Naomi remained still, but everything about her presence had changed, not louder, not proud, just certain, as if she no longer needed permission to exist in the space she occupied. One of the women who had laughed earlier adjusted her dress, her voice softer now. We did not mean anything by it, she said, though even she seemed unsure who she was trying to convince, and the man's gaze moved to her briefly, not unkind, but clear. Intent does not erase impact, he replied, and the words settled gently but firmly, leaving no room for argument, only reflection. The room absorbed it, each person holding it differently, some with discomfort, some with quiet understanding, and some with the first signs of change. Naomi looked down at her hands for a moment, the same hands that had carried trays, cleaned tables, and once held on to a frightened child near a riverbank, hands that had never been anything but steady when it mattered. And now they rested calmly at her sides, no longer trembling, no longer shrinking. The man turned slightly, his attention moving from the center of the room to the edges, to the people who had watched without speaking, who had chosen silence when it was easier than stepping in. It is not only those who speak, he said evenly. It is also those who choose not to, and that landed just as deeply, because silence, too, had been part of what brought this moment here. Daniel shifted again, clearly understanding that whatever control he had once held over the evening was gone, replaced by something far more meaningful and far less manageable. This will be addressed, he said quickly, as if action could restore balance. But the man did not respond. Because some things are not corrected with statements, they are remembered through consequence. Naomi lifted her gaze once more, meeting the man's eyes not with uncertainty, but with quiet clarity. And for the first time, there was no distance between who she was and how she was seen. The music in the background, which had continued faintly throughout, now felt distant, almost irrelevant, because the real moment had nothing to do with celebration anymore. It had become something else entirely, something that lingered beneath the surface long after words were spoken. And as the room stood in that quiet shift, it became clear that no apology, no correction, no attempt to move forward would erase what had been revealed, because the night had already done what it was meant to do. It had shown everyone exactly who they were when they believed no one important was watching. The room did not return to its former rhythm, even as the music slowly rose again in the background, softer now, almost cautious, as if it too understood that something irreversible had taken place. People resumed movement, but not the same way, not with the same careless confidence. Conversations restarted in low tones, measured, aware, because every glance now carried memory, every word passed through a new filter, and at the center of it all, Naomi stood no longer as someone blending into the background, but as someone fully present, fully seen. Daniel Reeves approached her again. But this time there was no authority in his steps, only careful intention. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice controlled, but noticeably different. "I owe you an apology." And Naomi looked at him, not with triumph, not with resentment, but with calm clarity. "You owe yourself better," she replied gently, and the words landed without accusation, without anger, but with a truth that left no space for defense. Daniel nodded once, slower this time, as if understanding that what he had lost was not just control of the room, but something deeper, something harder to rebuild. Nearby, the guests who had once laughed avoided meeting her eyes directly, some offering quiet nods, others simply stepping aside as she moved, creating space where before there had been none, not out of fear, but out of recognition. The man who had changed everything watched for a moment longer, his gaze steady, not possessive, not claiming, simply ensuring that what had been set into motion would hold. And then, just as quietly as he had entered the moment, he stepped back, returning to the edges of the room, because his role had never been to take the spotlight, only to reveal what had already been there. Naomi took a slow breath, her fingers brushing the bracelet once more, but this time the gesture was different, no longer tied to a memory she carried alone, but to a moment that had come full circle in a way she had never expected. She picked up the cloth from the table beside her and calmly wiped the last trace of wine from the floor, not because she had been told to, not because she had been forced to, but because the act itself no longer defined her. It was simply part of what she did, and that difference changed everything. The room watched without realizing it, witnessing something subtle but powerful, dignity not restored, but revealed. And as she stood again, placing the cloth aside, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only quiet presence. The man's eyes met hers one last time from across the room, and he gave a slight nod, not as a command, not as a signal, but as acknowledgement, equal, complete. And then he turned away, blending back into the world that had always been his, leaving behind a room that would never quite see itself the same again. And in that lingering silence, beneath the soft music and shifting conversations, one truth remained, clear and undeniable, that respect is never defined by status, never granted by wealth, but revealed in the moments when no one believes it matters. And that night, everyone in that room learned exactly what dignity looks like.